I walked through the front door expecting the usual Tuesday evening routine: leftover pasta, mindless TV, maybe some discussion about weekend plans. Instead, I found my wife Sarah standing in the kitchen with her arms crossed, a laminated sheet of paper positioned prominently on the counter like some sort of legal document. "What's this?" I asked, dropping my keys and approaching the counter with genuine curiosity. "Our new marriage rules," she announced, her tone deadly serious. "I've been thinking about our relationship structure, and I believe we need clearer boundaries and expectations." I picked up the laminated sheet, its glossy surface reflecting the overhead lights. At the top, in bold Arial font, were the words "Marriage Partnership Guidelines," followed by a numbered list that made my eyebrows climb higher with each item I read. Rule number 1. Location sharing must be active at all times, I read aloud. Rule number 2. All purchases over $50 require prior approval. Rule number 3. Hourly check-in texts during work hours. I looked up at Sarah, searching her face for any sign this was an elaborate joke. "Are you serious right now?" Her expression didn't waver. "Completely serious. Keep reading." I continued scanning the list, my disbelief growing with each rule. Password sharing for all social media accounts, detailed itineraries for any time spent away from home, pre-approved friend lists, evening curfews, no socializing with female colleagues without prior notification. All work events must be documented with photos, random phone checks allowed at any time. The list went on and on, 20 rules in total, each one more controlling than the last. "Sarah," I said slowly, setting the paper down, "this reads like a parole officer's checklist." "It's about accountability," she replied firmly. "About building trust and transparency in our marriage." As I stood there processing what I was seeing, my mind flashed back to the past 6 months. It hadn't happened overnight, this transformation from supportive partner to micromanager. It started with small comments about my spending habits, then escalated to questions about where I'd been and who I'd talked to. The influence had been subtle at first. Sarah would come home from their coffee dates with new theories about male accountability and relationship transparency. She'd started asking pointed questions about my female coworkers, demanding to know why Jennifer from marketing had liked my LinkedIn post, or why I'd been in a meeting with Rebecca from HR without mentioning it. What I thought was a phase had apparently crystallized into this laminated manifesto of control. But there was something else bothering me, something I'd been trying not to think about. Sarah's phone had become increasingly off-limits to me. She'd changed her passcode twice in the past month, always with some excuse about updating security. She'd started taking calls in other rooms, speaking in hushed tones before claiming it was just work or her sister. Most telling of all, she'd become obsessed with my whereabouts while being increasingly vague about her own. I looked at the rules again, then at my wife's expectant face. Part of me wanted to crumple up the paper and walk away. Another part wanted to argue each rule point by point. But as I stood there, a different approach began to form in my mind, one that was both simpler and more elegant than either fighting or fleeing. "Okay," I said finally, picking up the paper. "I'll play along." Sarah's face lit up with surprise and satisfaction. "Really?" "Really. But let me read through these more carefully first. Make sure I understand what you're asking for." That night, I played the role of compliant husband. I activated location sharing on my phone, responded to her hourly check-in texts with polite updates, and even asked permission before ordering a $60 book online. Sarah was practically glowing as she texted updates to her friends about my cooperation. "See?" she said as she watched me photograph my receipt from lunch and send it to her. "This isn't so hard. It's just about being transparent." But while she was celebrating her apparent victory, I was studying the rules with the methodical attention of a lawyer reviewing a contract. Each rule was written from the perspective of what I needed to do, what I needed to share, what I needed to ask permission for. They were entirely one-sided, which gave me exactly the leverage I needed. More importantly, I was taking notes. When Sarah went to her yoga class on Wednesday night, I noticed she'd disabled her location sharing for privacy during her workout. When she took a call from Lisa and stepped onto the patio, I could see her smiling and laughing in a way she hadn't with me in months. When she claimed she needed to work late on Thursday, her location showed her at a restaurant across town. The pieces were falling into place, painting a picture I didn't want to see but couldn't ignore. Sarah's sudden obsession with my fidelity was starting to look less like paranoia and more like projection. Friday evening, as we sat down for dinner, I waited until Sarah had finished telling me about her productive day before making my announcement. "I've been thinking about your rules," I began, pulling the laminated sheet from my pocket, "and I'd like to add just one rule of my own." Sarah looked pleased. "Of course. What did you have in mind?" I smoothed the paper on the table between us and looked directly into her eyes. "Every rule you wrote for me now applies to you, with 0 exceptions." The color drained from her face. "What do you mean?" "I mean exactly what I said." I picked up the list and began reading. Rule number 1. Location sharing must be active at all times. That means your phone too, Sarah. I should be able to see exactly where you are every minute of every day. No more convenient privacy mode during yoga class. Rule number 2, I continued, all purchases over $50 require prior approval. That includes your shopping trips, your coffee dates, that yoga membership you've been talking about. And since we're being transparent, I'll need to see exactly what you spent at Bella Vista restaurant on Thursday when you were supposedly working late. Sarah's face went white. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Rule number 3, hourly check-in texts during work hours. That means during your meetings, during lunch, during every break. Rule number 4, password sharing for all social media accounts. I'll need your Facebook, Instagram, everything. Oh, and rule number 15, all phone calls must be taken in the presence of spouse unless work-related. So those private conversations with Lisa will need to happen right here in the living room. "This is ridiculous," she finally managed. "Those rules weren't meant for me." "Why not?" I asked, my tone remaining perfectly calm. "If these are good rules for building trust and accountability in our marriage, shouldn't they apply to both partners equally?" She stared at me, clearly struggling to find an argument that didn't sound hypocritical. "It's different," she said weakly. "How is it different?" "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like the person who's actually been hiding things isn't me." I leaned forward slightly. "Sarah, where were you Thursday night? And don't say working late, because your location was at Bella Vista until almost midnight." The silence stretched between us like a chasm. Sarah's hands trembled as she reached for her water glass. "It's not what you think," she whispered. "Then tell me what it is. Because these rules you've created, they're starting to look less like marriage guidelines and more like a smokescreen." She broke down then, tears streaming down her face as the truth came pouring out. There was someone else, David from her office. It had started as harmless flirting, then progressed to lunch dates, then dinner meetings that weren't really about work. She hadn't slept with him, she insisted, but she'd been considering it. The guilt and paranoia about her emotional affair had manifested as suspicious hypervigilance about my behavior. "I kept thinking if you were doing what I was doing, then it would somehow make it okay," she sobbed. "Lisa kept telling me all men cheat, so I convinced myself you probably were too. The rules were supposed to catch you, or at least make me feel like I had some control over the situation." I sat back in my chair, processing this confession. The woman who'd demanded unprecedented transparency from me had been living a double life for months. The irony would have been funny if it weren't so devastating. "So let me get this straight," I said quietly. "You created 20 rules to control my behavior because you were guilty about your own?" She nodded miserably. "I know how it sounds. I know how wrong it was." Over the next 2 days, I enforced her rules with the same rigidity she'd expected from me, but now with the full knowledge of what we were really dealing with. When she claimed she was going to lunch with her sister, I demanded to see her location and called her sister to verify. When she tried to take a call from David, I reminded her about rule number 15 and insisted she put it on speaker. The psychological pressure was immense. Sarah found herself living under the same microscope she'd created for me, but with the added weight of actual guilt. She couldn't meet my eyes when I asked for her daily schedule. She jumped every time her phone buzzed. The confident woman who'd presented me with 20 rules was crumbling under the weight of having to follow just one: complete reciprocity. By Sunday evening, Sarah was exhausted and defeated. She sat at the kitchen table, the laminated sheet between us, looking like she'd aged 5 years in 5 days. "I can't do this anymore," she said, her voice hollow. "Can't do what? Follow the rules you created? I can't live with the guilt. I can't live with the lies. I can't live knowing that everything I accused you of, I was actually doing myself." She told me everything then. How David had pursued her with compliments and attention during a difficult period in our marriage. How she'd justified the emotional intimacy by convincing herself I was probably doing the same thing. How Lisa had encouraged the affair by constantly reinforcing the narrative that all husbands cheat. How the rules were meant to either catch me in infidelity or create enough control to make her feel powerful instead of guilty. "The worst part," she said, tears streaming down her face, "is that you never did anything wrong. You were just living your life normally while I was building this elaborate conspiracy theory to justify my own betrayal." I stared at her across the table, this woman I'd shared 8 years of marriage with, trying to reconcile the person I thought I knew with the one sitting before me. "What do you want from me, Sarah? Forgiveness? Permission to continue your affair? Or are you just confessing because the rules made it impossible to hide anymore?" "I want to fix this," she said desperately. "I ended things with David on Friday. I told him I was married and I'd made a terrible mistake. I want to earn back your trust." "With 20 rules?" I asked, gesturing to the laminated sheet. She looked at the paper, then slowly picked it up and walked over to the paper shredder in the corner of the kitchen. The machine hummed as it chewed up her 20 rules into thin strips. "No," she said, turning back to face me. "With honesty, with time, with whatever it takes." The conversation that followed lasted until sunrise. Sarah answered every question I asked about the affair: when it started, how far it had gone, what she'd told David about our marriage, why she'd chosen to betray rather than communicate. The most painful revelation was how calculated it had been. The rules weren't born from sudden paranoia. They were designed as a deflection strategy. If she could make me the subject of suspicion, her own guilty behavior would go unnoticed. It was manipulation disguised as marital improvement. "I need time to think," I told her as dawn broke through our kitchen windows. "This isn't just about forgiveness. This is about whether we have anything left to build on." Sarah nodded, her face puffy from crying. "I understand. I'll stay at my sister's while you decide." As she packed a bag, I sat alone with the shredded remains of her 20 rules scattered in the recycling bin. The elegant simplicity of my counterstrike had worked better than I'd imagined. I hadn't needed to argue with each individual restriction or mount some dramatic rebellion. I'd simply insisted on reciprocity, and that single principle had exposed the entire foundation of lies beneath her demands. One rule had been enough to end her game. What's good for one spouse is good for both. But as I looked around our empty house, I wondered if that same rule could rebuild what we'd lost, or if some betrayals cut too deep for reciprocity to heal.